Good to see everyone this morning. We had a great time last night. Glad to see everyone that came out. It came out for what was formerly known as the Keiths Out of Egypt presentation, but it has got a new name. And so this morning, Carla was putting together the pictures to be able to show on the screen here. And so she's like, okay, they're all in the folder. You just got to get the folder, transfer it over, and bring it to church. So I'm looking for the Keiths Out of Egypt presentation, right? You're laughing now, aren't you? Yeah. No, it was titled Chicken Dinner 2014. Bob. Yes, apparently. Yes, apparently. Although it kind of reminded me, the chicken was awesome. John, Larry, thank you. It was incredible. And it reminded me of a vacation that Carla and I once went on. It was one of those vacation package things, you know. And so it was like, yeah, chicken dinner. Come for the chicken dinner. It's free. There's no further obligations, but you do have to sit through the presentation. Apparently it was worth it because a lot of people showed up for the chicken dinner. Larry said that there was 70 people there last night. So we said from now on we're going to have John come. We're going to say there's going to be a chicken dinner. Whether there's going to be a chicken dinner or not, we'll say that there's going to be a chicken dinner. And so thank you very much, Larry, John, everyone else that participated, all those that brought food. It was a fun time. Well, I'd like to open in prayer, and then I'd like to get into the presentation. And a couple of people reminded me that I said 30 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see what God gives, as was a major thing on the trip. We said all the time, we'll see what God gives. Let's pray. Father, we give you thanks. And Lord, I just thank you for our fellowship, for our congregation, just for a place to be and a place to become, a place where there's love and there's unity. Lord, we thank you that we can belong to the church that you established, and here it is, over 2,000 years later, on the other side of the world, in an obscure place where the roads in the wintertime are constantly covered with snow and ice, and yet here we are. And I thank you for bringing us safely tonight, and we just trust that you'll bring us safely home as well. And now, Lord, as I stumble through this presentation, I pray that you bring it to each of your good followers, your servants, in the way that you intend, and that it might not only be entertaining, but it might be encouraging, it might be inspiring, it might be challenging. We give thanks and praise to you, all honor and glory to Jesus. Amen. The first thing I should do is say thank you. There was a couple in our congregation that surprised me. So they had sent me an email and said, hey, how would you feel about going on a trip to Egypt and to Israel and to Jordan, and if you would be interested, they said, pray about it, and if you're interested, it'll be our gift to you. So I prayed, the only prayer that is appropriate at the time. Thank you, Jesus! So a prayer of thanksgiving. It was a huge gift. So it was actually kind of hard and humbling to accept it. At the same time, I'd be stupid not to. So of course I was going to go. And so I owe a great debt of gratitude. And what it was is that she went to a church in Holland, Michigan. And this is George DeYoung. He is the pastor of that church, and he's been the pastor there for almost over 25 years. And George, he has done trips with Ray Vander Laan. In fact, that's kind of how he started. They're very good friends. And then he launched out his own ministry. He's been doing this for about 10 years. He's also a senior pastor, but he takes about 5 trips or more a year. In fact, they're in the Holy Land right now with a group. So he's been doing this for quite some time, and you can tell. And he does it very much in the spirit of Ray Vander Laan. And so when this couple had found out, they stopped in at the church, and they asked him, so when's your next trip? And he told them, well, it's going to be in a month. And he said, well, do you have any extra spots? He said, we got 1 extra spot. They said, well, reserve it. We want to send our pastor. And so they sent me that email, and they said, by the way, it leaves in a month. So I was like, are you kidding me? So this was pretty incredible. For George, as he leads these trips there, it's not tourism, it's spiritual formation. So it's learning about the Bible, and that's really the whole. He kept reminding us, you're not tourists. He says, there's going to be some things you don't see because you're not tourists, but I'll take you to better places. And he did. And he'd always say, we'll see what God gives. We'll see what God gives. Are we going to do this? We'll see what God gives. God sure gave a whole lot. If you're interested in this, the ministry is Under the Fig Tree. And you can go to underthefigtree, either .com or .org, and check it out there. This is the good-looking group that I got to travel with. I won't tell you all of their names. You won't remember it anyway. But we sure got to know each other very well on this trip. We started out in Egypt. The trip was called Out of Egypt. And what we were doing is going back and we were tracing Israel's footsteps from Egypt, understanding their time there. In fact, we spent a lot of time in Egypt. We were understanding what was God doing with Israel in Egypt. They spent over 400 years there as slaves, and even before that, Abraham was there for some time. We see lots of stuff happening in Egypt, and so we followed sort of their route. We started here in Cairo, and we traveled and traversed all of Egypt, and we're down here in the Valley of the Kings. This is where quite a number of pharaohs are buried. We're in Luxor, which I understand actually is where we get our term luxury from. There was a whole lot of wealth in Egypt. In fact, they're probably the longest standing empire in the world as far as power goes. We're in Edfu. We'll see a temple from there and down in Aswan. And then we made our way all the way back up to Cairo, flew down here into the Sinai Peninsula, and we spent a day just hiking in the Sinai. And then we traveled and crossed into Israel from Sinai, which was a big part of the trip. So again, it's following in the footsteps of Israel as they journeyed and trying to understand that journey and their formation, but then locking it into our journey. And George was the rabbi. And he would take us and he'd walk us to places. We'd sit down under trees or on rocks, and he would give us faith lessons. And he would connect the biblical story to our own lives. And so I'm hoping to be able to do some of that tonight. But there's a whole lot I've got to leave out. So if you want more of the details, you can ask me and I'll share some more with you, or you can go on the trip. And I'm sure that it is well worth it, although I say that not having paid for it myself. But if I had the money, I would pay the money to go on the trip. It was very, very, very good. So this is a little map down here, too, if you're not sure exactly where Egypt is in Africa. Egypt is a part of Africa, and this is around where it's at. We started off, when we got off the bus, we went on a plane. It took over 24 hours of traveling between plane and bus and all that. So we landed in Egypt in Cairo. It was nighttime. And so we went into the hotel, and it was pitch dark. When I woke up in the morning, and we got an early start every morning and walked outside the doors, I was very surprised to realize how close we were to the pyramids. You could actually see them, all three of the larger pyramids, right from the hotel that we were in, which is an amazing sight to wake up to. So here we are in Egypt, and we started off at the pyramids because, one, if you're in Egypt, why wouldn't you go see the pyramids, right? But two, because this is where Israel spent so much of their time and so much of where they were shaped and formed. In fact, I couldn't help but think about last week, we looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and the first part of it, and we were talking about how God forms us in darkness, right? And we compared that to the womb that we all begin in. And in much of the same way, as much as we don't like the troubles and the trials, that's where the greatest formation happens on our life journey. So here we are. We're in Egypt. We're at these pyramids. And the pyramids, they're sort of the epitome of the pharaoh's wealth and power and legacy. Why did the pharaohs make pyramids? Well, one answer, the short answer, is because they could. Because it was a huge sign and a legacy for them. And it was a way for them to immortalize themselves. I mean, we're looking at something that was built around 2500 BC. These are the pyramids of Giza. There are 5 there, 3 larger ones and a couple of smaller ones. And this is some 4,500 years later, and people are still traveling across the world to see this. And George would say, why Egypt? Why all of this? He said, Egypt built all of this because it showed that Egypt works. And the pharaohs work. So we're going to get into why it worked in a little while. Does anyone recognize these good-looking folks? This is Abraham and Sarah. Remember that Abraham came to Egypt. And remember that Sarah became one of the wives of the Pharaoh. Just to give a little context to how old these pyramids are, when Abraham and Sarah came through Egypt and perhaps even passed by these pyramids, since they were in a province where some of the pharaohs were, these pyramids, this pyramid, had already been standing for 1,000 years by the time Abraham and Sarah show up. What an incredible work. And it testifies to this incredible empire that God used as a place to birth and to form his children. This was an interesting bit of information I couldn't help but tell you. The pyramids are built west of the Nile. And when George asked us, why are they west of the Nile? Why are they out here in the wilderness? And we took our best guesses. But the way he explained it was, their faith and everything they believe was so intricate and so intentional. Every place that they've built, every temple, every pyramid is built with purpose and intentionality. And it goes, and it's a part of embedded in their faith. So they're west of the Nile, one, because it's on the other side, the western side of the Nile, which is the wilderness, which is a place of death. Well, why is it a place of death? Well, what side of the earth does the sun rise on? The east. And that's life coming forth. And then the sun sets, of course, in the west, just beyond these pyramids. And that's the place of death. And so they build these pyramids in a place that reminds us about the process of life and the process of death. We'll see some of this inside the Bible as well. Part of what I want you to be thinking is, in what way might this have helped shape and form Israel's understanding of who God is and what life is about? Now, this was pretty awesome. I actually got to go inside of a pyramid, into a tomb. I never dreamed that I would ever in my lifetime be standing there or doing this. So this is one of the lesser tombs because it's sort of an easy entrance to get to. So I don't know who was buried inside of here, but we did go in. Here is Terry, and this is Deb Cruz, and they're coming in to the opening. And then here is Barb Cruz and Brother Dale over here, and we're sitting up. You could actually climb some of the walls where there are probably statues and treasures that were on the walls, and these stands for them. And looking down, this is one of the actual tombs that where someone would have been laid. And everyone there is very short. So we actually went into some museums, museum in Egypt, and you can certainly see the size. So everything's very big out there, though, which was part of an interesting contrast. So Hebrews were in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. Why? And that's part of what I want to answer today, and I want to connect it with our lives as well. Here I am. Something surprising about Egypt that I learned is that almost everything is still made out of mud bricks. And do you remember that when the Israelites were in Egypt, they were slaves and their task was to make mud bricks. They're still making them the same way. See this little, right here you can see a little wooden form, just a crude wooden form that they make these mud bricks out of. And almost all the buildings, all the walls, everything is made out of mud bricks. And the ingredients to a mud brick are some dirt, some water, some straw, and some dung. And when you're there, you can smell the dung. So we all had our hand sanitizer out after this. But this is a lot of what the Israelites would have been doing, making mud bricks just this way. And they're still making them. They make them at nighttime. And they said they make thousands of them at this place a night. And then they sit out during the day to dry. But they also make them at nighttime so that, because it's so hot in Egypt. Even when we were there, we had a cool day by the pyramids, but then it got hot real quick after that. And when I say cool, probably 75, 80 degrees, which was very nice, actually. Here I am on my way to Elephantine Island. And Elephantine Island has a little story. The reason why we end up at Elephantine Island, there's a couple of reasons. But this is a place that was active in 1st century AD, and there was a large Jewish settlement on Elephantine Island in the 1st century AD. And if you remember the story from the Bible, that Herod was trying to kill Jesus when he was just a child. And so Joseph and Mary took him to Egypt to escape Herod. Well, history tells us that it's very, very likely that they would have came to Elephantine Island and lived here because of the large Jewish settlement already there. And lo and behold, Joseph, Mary, and little Jesus standing on the shore to greet me. You got to have some fun with this, right? But here's some shepherds, and here's some sheep and some goats, which you see all over the island. And here are just tons of ancient ruins. And so there's some Jewish ruins, but there's also a whole lot of Egyptian pagan ruins as well. Almost all of Egypt now is Muslim, which was kind of surprising. I never put that together. But almost all of them are Muslim now. Oh, I should tell you this. That when I was here, and here right now we're traveling on the Nile River. So I'm going to have a bunch of pictures from the Nile River, but I really have them so you can listen to a song that I love. And it's by Rich Mullins. Has anyone heard of Rich Mullins? He passed some time ago, and he has this song. This is actually from his last record that he recorded in a little church like this that had been abandoned. And he just felt God impressing upon him that he had to go into this church and record these songs. He didn't know why, but it had to be done right then. 9 days later, he died in a car accident. And so this is one of the songs from the album, and it's significant to me because when I was 19 and I converted to Christianity, Rich Mullins was one of the first Christian singers I listened to, and he brings us back in this song to Jesus being in Egypt when he was a boy, and how God was helping him to understand what his task was going to be later in life. So the song has to do with Jesus on the bank of the Nile and what he was learning.
Joseph took his wife and her child, and they went to Africa to escape the rage of a deadly king. There along the banks of the Nile, Jesus listened to the song that the captive children used to sing. They were singing,
My deliverer is coming, my deliverer is standing by. My deliverer is coming, my deliverer is standing by.
Yeah, so it was an amazing point where we found out we were all going to be able to jump out and swim in the Nile River. So that was quite an adventure. And here we are on Elephantine Island. And we saw here the Temple of Khnum. And Khnum is an ancient major Egyptian god who's sort of the creator of earth, of land, and of water. And what's interesting is that he is called a potter, and he has a potter's wheel, and from clay he forms human beings, and he places children in their mother's wombs in order for them to continue their formation. Now, what's interesting about this is that you'll see a lot of overlap. Of course, there are things that Israel has to unlearn, but remember that this is Israel's context. They don't have a Bible. They don't have a faith. Now, they probably know something about their father Abraham, who had some god, but they have lost touch with him. They are worshiping the pagan gods, and that's what we see as they're leaving Egypt. Moses has to introduce them to the one true God and tell them who he is. And so this is what they're learning. This is what they're worshiping during that time. And here's inside the temple a picture of Khnum, and everywhere we're going to see pictures carved into stone all over the place. Here we are down in Edfu, and this is a temple of Edfu. Khnum is also the god of the Nile, and the Nile is such a major part of Egypt. And now they've controlled the flooding of the Nile. But back then, the Nile would flood 5 to 8 miles out, and this temple, which is huge, would be completely covered by the Nile rivers, even though it's over 3 miles outside of the Nile's banks. And then it would be covered in silt. And the reason why this is so well preserved is because at some point the temple was abandoned, the Nile covered it in silt, and what the priests would do every year is they'd come and they'd dig it all back out. And it was kind of the creation story all over again. And they'd have all this silt that filled the temples, and it was put in the floodplain on purpose in order to be able to, as part of their faith and part of their religion. I don't have a lot of time to get into that, but I thought it was very interesting that they would build all these things within the floodplain on purpose. Everyone would have to leave the floodplain for months until the water would go back down, and then they'd return. But of course, that's what brought all the good soil in and the crops. Here's Sarah, and she is pointing to the top of a pyramid, which we found out is called a Ben-Ben. A lot of things in Egypt, as I'm sure you already are aware of, come to a point. And what I didn't know, which is very significant, is that there's a reason why there's so many pointed things. The obelisks that have a point is because this is understood to be the point of creation. And from the point of creation, everything else flows. And so the points and the obelisks were connected with the gods and the creation of the world and the universe. And so we stopped also in this temple, and we saw these obelisks, which, when I saw them, had an uncanny resemblance to another obelisk I had just seen a few months earlier in Washington, D.C. And so as I learned about these obelisks and the whole point of creation, and I'm connecting it with what we had just seen in Washington, D.C., which is called the Washington Monument, all of a sudden it all became clear. George Washington was, of course, our first president. And the Washington Monument is made in an obelisk form with a Ben-Ben on top, which is the point of creation, right? So the creation of a new world in some sense. And in fact, which may be a little disturbing, and we won't get into a whole lot tonight, if you look on the back of your $1 bill, in one of the symbols, and in Latin is actually written, a new world order. And that's what they understood when they were coming to create America, that there was this new world order that was beginning to form. And Washington stands as the first president, sort of at the beginning of all this that flows from it. But that's another story for another time, but just an interesting connection here. They are the people who built the country, and those who were behind the symbols certainly understood ancient history and empires and all of that. So here we are on our way to go and discover what is it that the Israelites were learning while they were in Egypt from the culture of that time which they lived in. Why Egypt? Another interesting tidbit we discovered, this is the ancient god Ma'at. Ma'at was a major god in Egypt, and Ma'at was a god of order. And we're going to see a big theme of order, which we also see introduced in the beginnings of the book of Genesis as well. Order was a huge thing inside of Egypt and the faith. There are many gods in Egypt, and the Pharaoh is a representative of the gods. In fact, in some sense, he's an incarnate god. We know that in Egypt, we have, at the time, the most religious place on the face of the earth. And Israel is brought to Egypt to learn how to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. The Egyptians loved their gods. The Egyptian culture was so permeated with their faith and with gods that it's everywhere. There are statues everywhere. There are temples everywhere. There are writings everywhere. Every part of their life is infused with the gods. And this is the place where Israel begins to get formed. There's some things that also Israel learned from there, and perhaps not intentionally, not that the Egyptians wanted to, but that God wanted them to learn. They learned the difference between having wealth, which there was plenty of in Egypt, and wealth having you. And so they would understand that wealth was to serve them, they weren't to serve wealth. Wealth wasn't something to be worshipped. Slavery also. They learned how to be powerful, but to use it for love. How many times in the Bible does it remind them, and treat the sojourner and the alien among you well? Because remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. It's a lesson that we have to remember here in America as well. I saw something I thought was rather funny today. Someone said, my Irish grandfather did not come all the way across the sea to live in America in order for immigrants to take over this land. I thought, yeah, good point. So that's a big thing that we can, as Christians, can kind of remember, that the Bible reminds us, treat the immigrant, treat the alien, the sojourner among you well, because you were once slaves in Egypt. Holy writings. This was something new and interesting. I never thought of this concept, but when you're in Egypt, you see these holy writings all over the place. As you travel down the Nile, you see writings from thousands of years ago still encarved on the large stones on the banks of the Nile. And all these writings are holy writings, hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphic literally means holy writing. And so here we have a stone in an old temple complex area, and whenever you see a stone with this circle, kind of an egg around it, inside is always the name of the pharaoh. And the concept is that within this circle, within there, is order. And of course, Pharaoh is the one who brings the order, representing the gods, and that outside of the circle is chaos. And so we'll see this a couple of other places as well. And this is just one picture of 1,000 of them, of some of the imagery and the writings that are all over the walls and especially the temples. And all of it is a reminder. It's all holy writings. It's all a reminder of the gods, what they've done, and what it means for the order of our lives. Here is a temple that at first look, it looks like all these mud bricks are just something over history, I figured, really bent them out of shape. But actually, this is actually the way it was built on purpose, in a wave pattern. And the reason why is the same idea of order. See, these are the temple walls, and outside the temple is chaos. And inside the temple is order. And this wave pattern, much like Genesis, and he was hovering over these waters, the waters representing chaos, and then God starts putting order to everything. And the concept was, inside Egypt there's order. Outside of Egypt there's chaos. The same theme comes up in the Bible over and over again. Think about the Garden of Eden. Inside the garden, there was order. They walked with God. They talked with God. Everything was in its place. Everything was good. And then they sinned, and they were cast out. And outside was wilderness and chaos. And we teach the same today. Inside, relationship with God. That there is peace, there is harmony, there is goodness, there is transformation, there is order. Outside of relationship with God, everything gets very chaotic very quickly. The Hebrew temple would actually be built similar to the temples in Egypt. In all of the temples in Egypt, you have these things: the people's court, the priest's court, and the Holy of Holies. The difference with the Israelites was that there's only one temple. You know, like we call churches the house of God. That actually is not from Israelite understanding or Jewish theology. For the Jewish, they had many synagogues, and that's really what our churches are. They follow the pattern of a synagogue. There was only one house of God, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. And this is one of the ways that they deviate. But when you go into the temples, you'll find the same setup as you find in the Israelite temples. In fact, here we're walking through something. You see all these major columns. This is the priest's court, which is also called the Sea of Reeds. Isn't it interesting that when Israel comes out of Egypt, they go across the Red Sea, which literally translated is the Sea of Reeds in the Bible. And all of a sudden you connect this concept that they're walking through the priest's court. They become the priests of the world. Israel, a chosen nation, in order to be able to bring God and mediate God's presence to the world. And then when you get to the New Testament, it's laid out more clearly, you are a holy priesthood. And so we're all called to be priests. So that was a pretty neat connection. Here are some other temples. Here on bottom, it was awesome. There's not very much tourism going on in Egypt right now. I don't understand why. Actually, it's a very safe place, but I will admit we did have some armed guards with automatic weapons following us when we were on the tour bus. There would always be a police car behind us. And they said, no, it's just so that you feel safe. You know, you don't need it. You just makes you feel safer because everybody's worried. I said, no, it's not making me feel safer, actually. When I'm looking out the back and notice there's always a police car behind us. And we always had someone on the bus. But actually, the people that we ran into were very friendly, and we went to some areas that weren't tourist areas. And most of the places, even the pyramids, there was hardly anyone there. Like we went into that tomb, which usually there would be people cycling constantly in and out. We had it for a half an hour all to ourselves. So they say it's a terrible deal for Egypt right now because so much of their economy runs on tourism. It's a great deal if you want to go and visit and have time to really look at things. And so we sat inside this temple, and this is one of the Holy of Holies that we're in, and we had a faith lesson. inside of here. And one of the things that really struck me is that as I was sitting this, I could just picture these people that were coming in and out of this temple, the priests, the people, and this was, thousands of years ago. And here we are. God is still working in time and history and revealing more and more. And I just felt a much deeper connection to humanity throughout the ages. And that was a good experience. Jesus becomes human, and he connects with us. But so often we fail to connect with one another and other cultures. Here's another great statue at the Temple of Amenhotep. Actually, there's two statues, and this is sort of the gate. You walk between these two giant statues to enter this temple area. And notice this is George. George is actually very tall. He's much taller than I am, probably about 4 or 5 inches taller. And so you notice right away that compared to this statue, he looks very small. One, we can't figure out how they made such large things without the equipment that we have today. But he was just telling us, that was this is all done on purpose, this gigantic statues, because you felt small when you were there, and the gods felt very big. So isn't it interesting that our God works just the opposite way? Just the opposite of what you think, that Jesus became like us, that he became very small, born and laid in a manger, very vulnerable, in order to connect with us, to walk among us, in order to be able to identify with us. And one of the most amazing things is that even after the resurrection, Jesus maintains his humanity. For all of eternity, God has chosen to identify with us by maintaining humanity. You'll see my hands, my side. That's huge. The Egyptian temple was their Bible, right? They didn't have a lot of papyri during this time. They wrote on stone. They filled their temples, they filled their walls, every place with sacred writings, stories depicted on the walls, statues everywhere, reminding them of faith, reminding them of their history. And we see in the New Testament, you are God's Holy of Holies. You are living stones. This came to life to me when I started seeing what it means for in Egypt to have all these stones and God's imprint or the story of the gods on them. And now we are called living stones. In other words, we image. George kept saying God is looking for people to be the message. We got enough people bringing the message. He needs people to be the message, to be read of by men. In Egypt, Israel learned how to embrace faith in every aspect of life. They learned the difference between having prosperity and prosperity having you, and they learned that in God we have life, and apart from God is wilderness. And so God draws them out. He comes up with 10 plagues that shows that he is more powerful than the major gods of Egypt. He proves himself to Israel. He proves that he exists. He reveals himself in history, not just in story or myth. He demonstrates his merit, and then he invites them into his story, just as we're invited into the story through Jesus. And they write on stone because stone is eternal. Thousands of years later, these stones are still there, still telling the story. We're still traveling to see them. And that's why we're called living stones, carrying a message. Now it's time to leave Egypt. And I guess what I kind of want you to take away with that is that this was a dark time for Israel, but it's where they were shaped and formed. And that in our own lives, in our own dark times, they also serve a purpose of shaping and forming us. Don't despise your wildernesses. Here's some pictures of some life going on, common life. Here's some kids waving goodbye to us. Kids playing in their playground. The kids there just playing wherever they can. This is just a dirt mound on the side of the road. Here's the shepherdesses. And I couldn't believe how much shepherding there is that's still going on there. These are the sheaves. The Bible also talks about bringing in the sheaves. So these are some sheaves that are being set out to dry. And here are some folks bringing in the sheaves. And the donkeys. I couldn't believe that how many donkeys are still in use today. I mean, donkeys everywhere. I mean, in the roads, there's cars and there's donkeys on their roads. And this is one of the busier towns. The other places were more rural. And so this is what the city life, a lot of their city life looks like. All right, now we're heading into the Sinai wilderness. There's George and Michaela getting ready. Come, follow me, he'd say. Here we are. We spent a day in the Sinai hiking, and what I discovered is that the Sinai is nothing like what I thought. Everything is rock and hill. There is hardly any flat ground in the Sinai wilderness. And so he took us on this journey, and this is the less strenuous tour. I couldn't believe it. I told him after, I said I would have never have brought some of the folks that we had here on this journey, but everybody made it. You see Jake here, and he's helping Robbie up. It became pretty strenuous, and there were times some people said, well, I'll just wait here, I'll stop here, and on your way back, pick me up. Well, and George, being the shepherd, sort of a Moses figure, would go back, and he'd say, no, come on, I'll help you through. And we're all helping each other, but there are some times where people just were like, I'm done. And then you don't know what to do as one of the co-travelers. But George, kind of as the Moses, the shepherd figure, showed us what it looks like to go back and to encourage and to help people along on their journey. So that was a huge faith lesson. As we're traveling, here's some of the scenery. I managed to capture a couple of pictures on the way up. This is where Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness and traversing this land with people of all ages. Again, this is, if you like the less strenuous tour, this is it. This is them hand over foot climbing on some of this stuff. Well, I was a little worried for people at different times. But we made it to the top. This was about 3 days into our journey, and it was in the Sinai that we truly became a community, as we had to learn to depend on one another. We got toward the end of the journey, and we ran out of water. That was unplanned. But remember that Israel had run out of water where they're in the wilderness, and Moses had to hit a rock. Well, unbeknownst to us, George didn't quite have those skills apparently, so he sent Jake ahead to get the bus to come forward, and they were going through the wilderness, dragging this cart with water in it, and we made it, and everyone was just fine, and nobody realized quite how dire. We didn't figure it out until everyone said, anyone have any extra water? I'm out. I'm out too. I'm out. And then George's like, oh man. It's not supposed to happen this way, but it did, and it was a good faith lesson for us. Here's a tabernacle that's set up, and this is what it would have looked like. The Israelites had to carry this, and they would pack it up, and they'd carry it through the wilderness with them. So this was the temple in the wilderness place, and this is an altar right here with the four corners of the altar. And we went inside into the Holy of Holies there, and the Ark of the Covenant was set up inside of there, just to give us kind of an idea of what it would have looked like to set up camp in the wilderness and to have the tabernacle in there. Some more pictures of the wilderness. Can you imagine spending 40 years in this? There were some wadis, some rivers that come through, but they only come through at certain times of the year, and then they dry up. And when you finally find a shade tree, you sure are thankful for it. Paths of righteousness. I never knew this. The Bible talks a lot about how he leads us along paths of righteousness. These are paths of righteousness, and these are goats following the paths of righteousness. A couple of things stand out right away. One, they're not straight. So what does it mean when it says, these straight paths of righteousness? And George said, because the path is straight. So what makes the path straight is that you're following the shepherd. That's what makes the path straight. A whole different concept. We think so literally, right? And then all these paths, the other thing you notice is that the goats are all on different paths. And we're talking about how, each one of us travel a different path. But they're all the paths of righteousness. And so long as we're all following the shepherd, it's okay to be on different paths. In fact, it's necessary. I thought that was a neat faith lesson as well. There's some camels out there, and apparently these camels are all owned, but the shepherds don't need to be with the camels because they come home every night. So they wander in the wilderness and they come home at night. Interesting. Here's Cindy petting one of the camels. Of course, if you want to pet a camel, all you have to go down is to the road, and there's plenty of camels down there. But don't feel too bad for me, because this is where I stayed after hiking in the Sinai wilderness. This is down in the Sinai Peninsula, and this is the Red Sea. And this little dock out here is where I would jump off and go snorkeling along the coral reefs. And there would be wonderful tropical fish. I've never done that in my life. It was an incredible experience. So there was a lot of fun to be had. It wasn't just all history. It wasn't just all spiritual formation. Although I would say this was very spiritually forming too. I mean, I was just amazed. I'm like in the glory of God when I'm under that water and just seeing those fish, seeing these coral reefs. What an experience. And then into the promised land. we went through the Sinai and passed into the Promised Land, which was a huge moment for us as we were thinking about Israel coming across that border and into the Promised Land. One of the first things we saw there was Masada. Masada is one of Herod's fortresses. It's also known as a Jewish tomb because later, around 70 AD, in the major Jewish revolt, when the temple would be destroyed, many of the Jews would hide here at Masada. And the Romans came and they surrounded it for months, and then they finally built this ramp, the siege ramp. And this is the siege ramp that they built in order to break into Masada. And it's still there today. When they broke into Masada, what they found really impressed them. What they found was that the Jewish people, rather than becoming slaves, all took their own lives. Sort of a testament to how terrible slavery was, but it also shook a lot of the Roman soldiers too. Kind of a wake-up call. There were actually 3 different places that we visited, 3 of Herod's fortresses, and what I also didn't realize is that there's a major contrast between Herod and Jesus. Herod is a king, and he rules like a king that shouldn't be ruling. Jesus is a king who comes, and he's among the people, and he's the true king, but he walks a different path among us. This is some of the walls in there. They were all covered with limestone, so we got to see what it would have looked like. So we have all this rough rock, but it would have been just an immaculate, wonderful palace, like you couldn't believe that they would have been able to even build back then. Here are some of the mosaics that are still around. These are from 1st century AD. And then we went off to where the Dead Sea Scrolls were in Qumran. And these are the caves in Qumran. I know some of you have been there. And there was a community in Qumran, the Essene community. This is one of the ritual baths. These people in Qumran had set themselves apart, and they were waiting for someone that they called the teacher of righteousness to come. And they believed that it was time for this teacher of righteousness or the Messiah to appear. And they were right. It's unfortunate that most of them missed him when he came. It's said that John the Baptist was most likely an Essene, and he's one that didn't miss the Messiah when he came. But there was about 50 ritual baths because they would write texts, and they would copy scriptures. And every time they would say the holy name or they would begin a new text, they'd go and have to wash themselves in these baths. So there was these intricate water systems bringing water in from the mountainous regions in order to fill this place with living water. It had to be living water, running water, that they washed themselves in. And then this is the Judean wilderness. This is where Jesus would have spent his 40 days in the wilderness, being tempted by the devil. And then this is one of my favorite points, strangely enough perhaps, but significant and surprising for me, is walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee by myself at night. And here I am looking across at the ancient city Tiberias, which is still called Tiberias, and I imagine that this must be where Jesus was when he said, "A city on a hill cannot be hidden." And here it is a little later at night. Now, they wouldn't have had these kind of electrical lights back then, but they would have had torches everywhere. And certainly you would have been able to see it. And so here's an ancient city that's on the same hill, same name as it would have been, and Jesus would have been looking out. It was just neat to be on the shores of Galilee, and I just realized how much happened on Galilee. The disciples were called on the shore of Galilee. And it reminded me that it'd be hard to talk about this. We're all called. We're all walking on the shores of life. And Jesus calls every single one of us, "Come, follow me." And so it was a good place to be. Here we are out on the Sea of Galilee. Good-looking tribe. And then it got real quiet when we were on that boat. Because you can look out on that boat and you can just imagine all those things that happened on that sea. From Jesus telling them to throw it over to the right-hand side of the boat, and all of a sudden they bring in this great catch of fish, to Jesus calming a storm, to Jesus walking out to the disciples on the boat on this water and calling Peter coming out of the boat and walking on the water, and Jesus having to reach down and pull him up out of these very same waters. It was just a wonderful place to be. There's our good-looking group again. In fact, this was a little scary because the boat started leaning. So there was a call to faith. I was brought back to Jesus in the bow, right? Ye of little faith. And I'm like, okay, I'm a pretty good swimmer, but we're quite far away. And this is us taking a float in the Dead Sea, which is pretty interesting. If you're on your stomach, it's actually hard to turn over And it's probably the closest thing to feeling like you're floating or flying that I've ever been to. More paths of righteousness in the wilderness. And then this is a cave that George brought us to. He said, I could bring you to the place where Jesus, was likely born and where they say he was born, but it's in the middle of the city now, and it's all touristy, and he said this is what it actually would have looked like. And this is a cave that's actually still being used by shepherds. We went in there. They still bring their flocks in here at night, and this is where they shelter in these kinds of caves. Caves everywhere, they're still being used. So you could smell the goats and the sheep when you're in there. The hair is everywhere. Cellophane wrappers from cigarette packs that the shepherds were smoking in there. They still spend the nights in there, and then we got to do a biblical teaching in there as well. So this is us inside one of those caves. And then that's me under an olive tree. An olive tree became kind of a significant thing. Here we are in an olive press. And this is a first century olive press. And the significant thing about this that was pointed out is that oil press in Hebrew is Get Shemin. And which reminds us of the place that Jesus is praying, Gethsemane, where Jesus was pressed and blood begins to come from his pores. Thought that was pretty significant. And here's looking out from the Mount of Olives onto Jerusalem. It is from the Mount of Olives that Jesus came on that Palm Sunday and came down into Jerusalem. Here we have the beautiful gate, Gate Beautiful. Now, this is a graveyard in front of it, and the gates have been blocked up. And this is significant. When the Muslims controlled Jerusalem, they blocked the gates and they put a graveyard in front of it for a very, very purposeful reason. Because it was said that when the Messiah was to come, he would come through the gates here. What they didn't know is that these are the gates that Jesus had already passed through. They put a graveyard in front of it and blocked it so that the Messiah couldn't come through there. But he had already been. And the graveyard is significant because now it becomes a sacred place. Right? Not even the Jews can mess with it now. But they can't thwart God's plan. Nobody can. This is me and George overlooking on the Mount of Olives, getting ready to come down and follow Jesus' footsteps down this path. Maybe others have gone down that path as well as we head down to where Jesus would have been coming and walking in, except for we couldn't go through the beautiful gate because it's blocked up. So we had to go through the Lion's Gate. And you can actually see some lions on there. This was very interesting. This is the Joppa Gate, and here's the large gate doors. And here's someone sitting in it, and then George is standing in it. And then he revealed this to us. At night, these gates would be closed in order to protect the city from any enemies. But sometimes people would need to get in at night. And so they had this little door inside the gates, and this is called the Eye of the Needle. So I thought that was pretty neat. And here is the Holy Wall, the Western Wall in Jerusalem. It used to be called the Wailing Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall because before Israel became a nation again, the Jews would come, and this is the closest they could get to the old Temple Mount, and they would pray for the restoration of Jerusalem and Israel. Now it's no longer called the Wailing Wall. It's called the Western Wall because that prayer has been answered, and Israel has become a nation again. We happen to be here unexpectedly on a high holy day. Not only was it the Sabbath, but it was Jewish New Year Day. And so you see people coming to begin worshiping on the Jewish New Year Day. And we actually got to go down at the wall and inside the synagogue that's just to the left there. This is the Via Dolorosa, which is the path that Jesus walked as he carried the cross, and as Simon then took it from him. Although I expect that it looks a lot different today than it did when Jesus walked it. Although perhaps it was a major walkway, and they probably took him down that on purpose so that it was very visible to everyone. But it has been highly commercialized now. People are selling everything they can sell there. But it was still neat to walk down that pathway. This is an ancient first century Jewish tomb. This was neat. George said, I'll take you to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where it's believed that Jesus' tomb is. But he said it doesn't look anything like Jesus' tomb anymore, so let me show you what Jesus' tomb would have looked like. Here in front, you can't see it too well, is a rolling stone. Here's a better picture. And there's actually a channel that it's in. And he said, what most people don't know is that this stone is actually made to roll. It's actually very easy to roll. So when the women came and said, who will roll away the stone? He said, that's because it had been sealed with a Roman seal. And so they needed permission to roll it away. but it would have been easy enough for someone to roll it back and forth. Then we head inside the tomb, and there's 3 different channels in there. This is where the body would have been laid in order for it to dry out until it became mostly just bones. Once it became bones, it would be moved to the middle section here, and the bones would be put into this ossuary. And then, in time, it would be here. And this is what the Bible means when it says, and they'll be gathered to their fathers. Their bones would go into this family tomb, and all the bones of the fathers and the family would be inside of that tomb. And then we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where there is a church, and this is built on what they believe is the ancient site of Jesus' tomb, which I didn't even get to see because we went so fast through it. And George kept reminding me, you're not tourists. And they were actually having, it was kind of neat, this is the entrance. We happened to be there on a Saturday. Not only was it the Jewish holy day of the New Year, but for Saturday night in an ancient church, and in Catholic churches today, there's Mass going on. So that was a pretty neat treat. So I go in there, and here they are doing Mass. And I happen to be passing this when I noticed these priests and monks and nuns coming down, and up here is the living quarters upstairs, and they were coming down for Mass. This is a St. Anne's Church in Jerusalem, and we had a nice surprise coming in here. We didn't know, but this is what we ended up doing, and it was quite remarkable. And John said that our new ministry center is going to have acoustics just like that. And actually the video was a little choppy, and it didn't do anything in order to capture sort of what it really sounded like in there. But it was just an amazing. We sounded like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which didn't come through quite as well on the recording. And then we went into Jordan, and the reason why we went into Jordan was to continue the theme of Herod versus Jesus. Herod was from Jordan, and also or from that area. And Jordan also is what was part of ancient Israel. And so we're continuing to see parts of ancient Israel, which in modern-day Jordan. This is one of the Karazams. These are the sands. Many Christians would have died in places like these during the time of the Christian persecution, where gladiators would have been fighting. And some of the ancient temples. This is a temple to Zeus. And this, I believe, is a temple to Artemis. And it later, as Christianity spread, would be converted into a church. And they would hold church services and convert these temples into churches. This is one of the amphitheaters, and George stood down there and just talked to us in a normal voice and didn't need a microphone, and we could just hear him clear as day. Now we're heading down to Petra. This is a fig tree, so of course we had to go under the fig tree and have a lesson. And we continue our journey on, some amazing sights. Have everyone seen Indiana Jones? You'll be familiar with this area because this is actually the same part that was from the movie. As we went down these large crags, and then we begin to see it. The temple treasury. This is an ancient tomb in Petra. In fact, there's many of them, but this is the best preserved, and this is the one that was in Indiana Jones. Although it's unlike Indiana Jones, there isn't actually a big maze underneath with all these. There's actually only 2 rooms in there. It's just a tomb. But this one was amazingly preserved. Because of the wadis coming through, and it was covered in silt, and it was dug out many years later. So some of the life that's going on there. These are tombs there, and there's also a city nearby, and up top is the Acropolis where the gods were. We went up top just because we always had to hike anything that looked like it was difficult. And this is looking down on the town. This is a lady that was entertaining us, and she got into one of the holes there. Another ancient theater. And then this is sort of ending our tour, another major hike. And we were going up. This is a wadi that's flowing, but it's down really low. So this was a very refreshing hike. And we were just learning about God, being the breeze and being the water. But it was a tough hike. There are places we just had to continue helping each other. There was, again, another place I just couldn't believe George brought everyone, because there was some place I was amazed that we got out of that without any major injuries. But at top, there was this incredible waterfall. And we just all basked in it. He said, this is the power of God. And this is what God feels like. And so we went in. And having seen enough movies, I decided that I was going to close my eyes and go as far as I could through the waterfall to see if there was any openings on the other side. And lo and behold, there were. There were large caverns on the other side. So this is actually me back there coming out to let everyone know about the caverns on the other side. Of course, George already knew that. So everyone started making their way in after that. And the way back was much easier. We mostly floated the whole way back, which was a pretty awesome ride. And this is us getting on our donkeys and getting ready to exit our journey. Very good. Sorry for the choppiness there. So, well, it was an amazing blessing, and it was an amazing thing, and I can already see it coming through as the Bible is just coming to life to me more. I pray that it continues to come to life to you more, but it's really about journey. All of our journeys are forming us and shaping us. Don't despise your journey. Amen? I'll close this in prayer. Father, we give you thanks and praise. You are an awesome God. We thank you for just capturing in the holy writings the journey of your people, which reflects our own journey if we just have eyes to see it. May we find ourselves in your story and know you, the one true God, in Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Amen. If you have any questions, I'll be here afterward, and you can follow up with me at any time, but I